impacts in 2004. It went over a small island called Grenada and many others, but just to give you an example, it cost Grenada 200% of its GDP, which is an astonishing figure, to think that an entire country's GDP could be wiped out twice over by one weather event. Other countries like Haiti are also extremely vulnerable to weather events. In 2008, Haiti was hit by 4 consecutive storms, Tropical Storm Faye, and 3 hurricanes, Gustave, Hannah, and Ike, causing huge damage to the island. Most of this partly due actually to a lack of trees on the hills, so a lot of rapid runoff and landslides, mudslides. Extreme weather events are becoming a major threat across the region. This is Jamaica. This is Tropical Storm Nicole. These are impacts on the coast in St. Kitts and Nevis. This is a photograph from Barbados, where coastal erosion on the west coast caused storms, and the loss of reef, unexplained, has caused major damage. And the region also has been seeing other climate-related impacts, particularly mass coral bleaching. This is a photograph from Tobago taken in 2010, where a mass coral bleaching event affected a very large part of the reefs. In 1998 and again in 2005 were other very severe mass coral bleaching events across the Caribbean, and these are related to warmer sea surface temperatures. So a region that is seeing some observations, I should say, this is not projection, these are observed changes that are happening very fast. And this is happening in a region which is already suffering from a lot of ecological stress. This particular map here is from Loretta Burke at the World Resource Institute, and shows the level of risk that many coral reefs in the Caribbean are exposed to. The colors you can see go from blue, which are reefs at low risk, to red, which are at very high risk, and these are risk from local threats. So these are risks associated with overfishing, pollution, and coastal development mostly. So a very high level of threat already on the reefs of the region, and this is going to be exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. Now, climate change will have a whole range of impacts in the region, and I just want to go through this slide, which I think explains nicely just how a simple initial change, which is an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, can have so many multiple varied effects on the coastal ecosystem. So higher concentrations of greenhouse gases lead to warmer air temperatures, warmer sea temperatures. And warmer sea temperatures are one of the main reasons for sea level rise. As you know, the other sea level rise because of thermal expansion of seawater. The other main reason is the melting of ice sheets and glaciers, not the floating ice, but the ice that's on rock, which contributes increasingly to sea level rise. But also warmer temperatures affect coral reefs, they cause bleaching, and they affect ecosystems as well by changing the currents, changing the availability of plankton, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and the upwelling currents. Warmer temperatures also cause more intense storms, much heavier and intense rainfall, which in turn causes greater sedimentation on coastal ecosystems, the runoff often being heavily laden with silt, affecting a whole range of coastal ecosystems, but particularly coral reefs. And finally, also greater concentrations of dissolved carbon dioxide in water turned to carbonic acid is leading to ocean acidification, which is another huge concern for the oceans. The effects of these still being discussed and debated, but clearly a great worry. How am I doing for speed, Maria? Please let me know if I'm too fast. I hope I've given you enough time.
Hey, Owen,
So,
sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, Hime.
Yes, Maria? It's okay?
We are
Okay, I'll
trying
continue.
to, yes. So, can we start again slides before, please, or 3 slides before, just to help Hime to translate for the
Sure.
translation.
About here?
Okay. Okay. Yes, and please, Hime asks for summarize the points, the main points of
Okay.
the presentation, so she can summarize on the chat.
Okay, I will try and keep it very,
That's fine.
very brief. So as I was saying,
yes,
warmer.
The main points, please. So
yeah, warmer sea temperatures.
We can facilitate the Hime translation.
I understand. Yes, I understand. So warmer sea temperatures lead to sea level rise, as well as ecological impacts like coral bleaching and changes in the nutrient supply and currents, ocean currents, as well as more intense storms. Intense storms which cause more runoff and more coastal nutrient supply. And ocean acidification is also a concern caused by the increased amount of carbon dioxide dissolving in seawater. Okay, so there are a wide range of effects that are being measured and also projected by the IPCC, but to understand how those effects will affect human society, we need to look at how vulnerability is related to the exposure to these effects. So in this diagram, it explains how one does a vulnerability assessment, which requires an understanding of exposure. So what is going to be affected by a particular hazard? What is the sensitivity? Yes, I can use the marker here. What is the sensitivity? So what characteristics make something more susceptible to harm. So, for instance, a very hard coastline made of rock will not be very sensitive to coastal erosion, but one made of a soft sediment will be much more sensitive. So the sensitivity and the exposure will give you the impact, and the impact, the problems caused by the impact will depend on the adaptive capacity of the community, of the geographical region that we're looking at. And the adaptive capacity is the ability of a system to anticipate, respond, adjust, cope, and recover to the impact. So if a community is very well able to cope with impacts, it has a high adaptive capacity and therefore will not be very vulnerable. But a community that has a very low adaptive capacity, which is very dependent, let's say, on a certain livelihood, which will be profoundly impacted by climate change, they will have a high vulnerability. So understanding this notion, this concept of vulnerability is very important in climate change adaptation studies. There is a large database of studies done in the Caribbean available at this website. And this is the website of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center that are based in Belize. And those interested in learning more should visit this very extensive database, clearinghouse, as it's called, that has hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of projects and research papers and initiatives from across the region. One of the big studies that we were involved with is called the Climate Change Risk Atlas, where we looked at vulnerability of 15 countries across the Caribbean. I won't go into all the details, where the translation challenges, but it was a large project that's available at on our website, and the findings from this very large study, which involved over 15 people for nearly 3 years, working in, as I said, 15 countries on a very wide range of sectors, found that food security was a major concern, water security, energy, and in particular coastal communities and coastal infrastructure. There is a very high level of vulnerability in the Caribbean associated with coastal communities, and this is linked to sea level rise, storm surges, and a reduced protection from degraded coastal ecosystems. Ecosystems providing less protection from storms in particular. To look at the effects of sea level rise in more detail, we were asked to do a study for the UNDP in partnership with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center called Modeling the Transformational Impacts and Costs of Sea Level Rise in the Caribbean. This was a very big study looking at the projected impacts of sea level rise by modeling, again, 15 countries, the elevations, and doing inundation mapping. So on our website, there are many reports available and animations to show how sea level rise will affect the Caribbean. I maybe skip this slide, there's too much information, but this is just to show the percentages of the land affected and major infrastructure and population affected by a 1 meter sea level rise. No need to translate this. This is showing that the main finding of the study was the cost, because we translated the impacts into dollar values by using actuarial methodologies. And the cost of sea level rise for CARICOM countries, these are 15 Caribbean countries that we looked at, were for mid-range sea level rise, if I use the cursor here, so 3.9 billion US dollars annual costs, 26 billion dollars capital costs by 2050, going up to 13.5 annual costs and 68.2 billion US dollars capital costs by the year 2080. And if we look at a higher sea level rise scenario, those figures are much higher, 6.1 billion annual costs and 60.7 for 2050, 19.4 by 2080, and 187 billion by 2080. So really enormous costs to adapt to climate change using these metrics, and a major concern for the region. So how does one deal with this? You know, how does one plan and adapt to climate change and sea level rise risks when you are on a small island or in a coastal community? There are three main ways of coping. One can accommodate or cope. Basically, you allow some flooding, you change the coastal uses, you raise your buildings. In some cases, you can have floating buildings, or you retreat. You move away from the coast and you enforce coastal setbacks. So you have to move back to higher ground further inland. And the third approach is to protect. You either build a wall or you engineer a structure that can stop the sea eroding the land. And finally, there are ecosystem-based options, which I want to talk about now. How to use nature. That's it, protection. So setbacks vary enormously on country to country. In fact, I won't go into the details here. Please don't translate this, but as you can see, some countries, like in the European Union, we have 100-meter minimum setbacks from the coast for building, 200 meters in Germany, 200 in Poland, etc. In small islands, of course, like Anguilla or Antigua, or the Bahamas, these setbacks are generally much smaller. Barbados, 30 meters or 10, because the land area is much smaller. You don't have the luxury for moving inland. And perhaps the most striking example of this would be in the Maldives. The capital of the Maldives is called Mali, and as you can see, it is surrounded by a seawall to stop the sea coming in. There is no possibility of having setbacks in this instance. There's not the land, there is not the space. So building seawalls is something that is being done all over the Caribbean, sometimes not very thoughtfully. Here is an example from Belize where a straight wall is causing problems in that it's not allowing any beach. It's not allowing any migration of the coastline. It was also quite ugly. Another one here is actually on a beach. Again, not a very good solution. You can see fresh water behind the wall, maybe a threat from mosquitoes, and not very nice for anybody wanting to use this beach. People are building defenses by hand with shovels. This is again in Belize. People using shells and sand to try and protect their homes. This man here lives in this house, and I photographed this a couple of years ago, just after a storm. So people are trying, sometimes with low technology methods. A much more sophisticated approach is in Barbados, where the Coastal Zone Management Unit, the CZ, the Coastal Zone Management Unit in Barbados, looked at an area of Barbados on the south coast, which was vulnerable. They did some modeling of 1 in 100 storm surge. You can see in blue, these are the areas that would be flooded by a storm surge. And they decided the only solution was to build a wall, a boardwalk. So they built coastal defenses, which are also a beautiful boardwalk. And they designed it very carefully to make sure that the beaches were going to be maintained. Here is one of the beaches by the boardwalk in Barbados that is actually growing because they designed it carefully with these rocky groins as well, rocky structures. So the boardwalk's been a great success in actually providing an attraction for locals and tourists, as well as allowing the beaches to actually expand. In Guyana, another example of a large coastal defense program. The seawall you can see here on the east coast of Guyana is about 35 kilometers long. It was built initially by the Dutch many years ago because the land inside the seawall is actually below sea level. So the population of Guyana, 90% of the population live on the east coast, actually below sea level at high tide. So these communities depend on massive pumps, which pump the water over the wall to maintain a dry environment behind the sea wall. It's a very big cost for the people of Guyana, as well as maintaining the seawall, which is, as I said, 35 kilometers long. The wall often breaks. Here we have a picture of the damage to the wall, and you can see flooding of the houses behind. And increasingly, people realize that the only solution is to work with nature and replant the mangroves were once present along the whole of the east coast. So there is a big program of mangrove replanting taking place to protect the seawall. So this is done outside the seawall and in other locations. Very successful project using local communities. The men go out on these mud flats on sledges because it's very thick mud and plant mangroves along the coast. So here a good example of mixing hard and soft engineering. This is similar to what was studied in Fiji by this study done on ecosystem-based adaptation and engineering options. And I won't go into the details, but a similar approach where people looked at different scenarios using either a fully ecosystem-based adaptation approach or an emphasis on ecosystem. So this is one scenario, ecosystem-based options, or an emphasis on ecosystem-based, or an emphasis on engineering, or engineering only. And they did a cost-benefit analysis and found that the ecosystem-based option gave you a higher cost-benefit ratio that did not protect necessarily some resources as effectively as an engineering option, but the cost-benefit was very strikingly higher. So the recommendations from that study, which are interesting in the Caribbean context, is that an adaptation plan focused on ecosystem-based adaptation options, which include engineering options, provides a high benefit to cost return in terms of avoided damages, as well as providing secondary ecosystem services. So combining the two is really a good approach in many instances, and the walls, the engineering, best for protecting towns. So ecosystem-based adaptation is gaining more and more recognition around the world, and basically it's an approach that uses a range of opportunities for the sustainable management, conservation, and restoration of ecosystems to provide services that enable people to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So EBA, as it's called, is regaining traction. The ecosystem-based adaptation approach requires that one maps and visualizes the vulnerability and the ecosystems. I'll just read the headings here. I won't go into too much detail. To assess the ecosystem value and its resilience, to work with and to empower the local communities, and to develop partnerships for implementation. Okay, map and visualize vulnerability in ecosystems, assess ecosystem value and resilience. Resilience is very important. I want to talk about that now. Work with local communities, and develop partnerships for implementation. Ecosystem services are very complex. I'll skip this slide, but they are based on a number of services that the environment provides. I just want to talk about the value of these ecosystem services briefly. There's been a lot of studies done on ecosystem value, and you can see from this graph that coral reefs, there's been 94 studies done. This is from a paper in 2012. 94 studies showed a value of between about 30,000 and well over $1 million, maybe $2 million US per hectare per year. So the average is about 300,000 US dollars per hectare per year for coral reefs. So very significant value, much greater than others. You see the marine ecosystems, the coastal systems, the wetland systems seem to have very high values, and this is largely because of their role in protecting the shoreline as well as providing habitat for fish. So shoreline protection here, an example from Grenada, This was supplied by Steve Schill from the Nature Conservancy. We're going to be working with him and other colleagues in Grenada, in the Caribbean, looking at ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. Here we see the coral reefs in the sea, and the dots here represent the wave attenuation that is being experienced by these coastal reefs, and showing a very important role they play in attenuating damage. And these reefs have been badly damaged, and restoring these reefs is now a priority to bring back some of the protection. So the value of Caribbean coral reefs across the region is very high, between 3 and 5 billion US dollars per year. But they are also declining very rapidly, and their decline has been highlighted by the BBC recently. There was a story on the BBC showing the results of a study published by the IUCN, UNEP, and the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, that Caribbean coral reefs could vanish in 20 years' time. This was a study, as I said, by IUCN, UNEP, and GCRM. The main author was Jeremy Jackson. And he highlights that the main threats causing the decline of Caribbean reefs is actually overfishing and destructive fishing. Other threats are also important, but fishing is the most important threat in the Caribbean right now, and global warming will add additional threats. But fishing, overfishing, has been the main problem, and this is because fish like parrotfish and sea urchins that graze the algae keep corals healthy and allow other species to live on them. If you take away the fish, the corals rapidly lose the fight. But this is a reversible process. If you bring back the fish, the reefs can recover, and so protecting the fish is extremely important for the reefs. I won't go into that slide. It's just some paper on resilience for the sake of time, but just to emphasize that managing coastal protection or improving coastal protection from coral reefs will depend on improving the management of reef fisheries. So this is where we have synergies between fisheries management and adaptation to climate change. How does one protect fisheries and reefs simultaneously? One very important strategy is to have networks of marine protected areas which benefit fisheries, tourism, and of course the ecosystems, allowing more resilient reefs, more resilient communities. I currently lead a big regional program called Seafish, or Caribbean Fish Sanctuaries Partnership Initiative, which is funded by the UK government, UK Aid, and it's being done in partnership with the Caribbean Community Climate Change Centre. And the aim is to improve the management of 15 no-take MPAs, so marine protected areas where there is no fishing in Jamaica, Grenada, St. Vincent and Grenadines, St. Lucia, and Dominica. It's a project that is built around a partnership with many private sector partners and Nature Conservancy, the University of the West Indies, and other partners, as you can see here. The objectives of the initiative are to support MPA management as a strategy for ecosystem-based adaptation, to provide financial and technical support for the management of community-based marine protected areas, to promote alternative livelihoods in fishing communities, to facilitate stakeholder participation and to monitor the effectiveness of MPA management, finally to promote public awareness. And we are working in Jamaica, as I said, which has some very degraded reefs, as well as in the Eastern Caribbean, in Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia. In Jamaica, we are supporting currently 7 marine protected areas in Med, and soon we'll increase by another 2. See here in Portland and here Discovery Bay. These MPAs are being managed by community groups, many by fishermen who actually want to rebuild their stocks of fish, and that will also help the reef. We provide funding. We've given out money to these community groups for enforcement, for wardens, for managers, for equipment. We buy boats. We've bought several patrol boats for Jamaica. We help the governance in training and monitoring. There's some more. This is a boat that was built. These are some wardens from Grenada. And monitoring is very important. And here we see local wardens that are former fishermen and measuring fish that they catch from the marine protected area. They measure their length, their weight, they write it down, and they return the fish unharmed to the marine park. Our initial data shows that these sanctuaries are working, and we are doing some more monitoring. So the fish biomass inside is greater than outside, and this is results from last year. We have new data, which hopefully will show even more interesting improvements. But from our visual assessments, it's clear that the fish are coming back very rapidly. Our project Seafish also deals with providing jobs. Alternative livelihoods are essential for these communities, and we provide support for craft, for community-based tourism, and offshore fishing. And we provide equipment for fishermen to fish further offshore. GPS and radios are very important for safety. And as I said, we work with private sector partners that help provide an access to markets. So the communities that are providing services and products, whether it's craft or community-based tours, offshore fishing, will have preferential treatment with these partners. Some of these, like Sandals, provide space in their gift shops for crafts produced by these communities. So it's about creating this circle of marine protected area management linked to jobs. So employment has to be connected to environmental management and economic activity that the private sector can help facilitate to create a sustainable program. Artificial reefs and coral transplantation is something we are also starting to do in Jamaica, and we believe is very important in helping reefs recover. In some places have statues. This is in Mexico, which can be used as a tourism attraction, but can also be used for planting coral or fruits. Another component is an aquacam instrument, which We are developing with the University of the West Indies and a consortium of scientists in Europe. It's an underwater video system to monitor fish populations using stereo video and very advanced software, computer vision software. And finally, communication is extremely important. So we have a website for this project called Seafish, social media, videos, newsletters, press releases, workshops, conferences. We need to use technologies to make sure communicate the benefits of marine protected areas and of ecosystem-based adaptation. It's essential to get communities and governments and the private sector working together. So this project is really not so much about the science, which has been developed previously and is strong. The policies were put in place by the government. This is more about implementation. How do we make ecosystem-based adaptation happen? So making it happen requires enforcement. It requires community-based management, and it requires financing. And all of these require political will and support and partnerships. I'm checking on the translation, Ximena, and you seem to be keeping up now. I'm just about finished. Conclusions. So the principles for effective ecosystem-based adaptation really are to restore and maintain resilient ecosystems. So ecosystems that can adapt to climate change because they can bounce back from a disturbance. They are able to recover, and that's really the key. And for that to happen, we need to model the climate change impact scenarios, so understand just what are the projections for climate change. We need to map and characterize the ecosystems and the ecosystem services. We need to estimate the value of the ecosystem services. Because when we present an ecosystem-based adaptation option, it has to be something that politicians and economists and accountants can understand, and they can relate that to their budgets, to their national plans, and that's why they have to have a value in the process. The options for conserving and restoring ecosystems need to be identified and assessed. We need to work with communities in planning and implementation, and use a multi-sectoral approach, and private sector partnerships are increasingly important. There are more opportunities now than ever before for working with the private sector. And finally, the recommendations need to be incorporated in national adaptation plans so that ecosystem-based adaptation is recognized as part of the national strategy for adaptation. And that's it. I just want to finish with a quote. I see I'm just waiting for a translator to catch up. Ximena has done a great job. I hope I didn't give her too much of a hard time initially. And finally, just a quote. This is from Dr. Pam Berry at the Environmental Change Institute in University of Oxford. We work with closely. The low-cost, flexible approaches of ecosystem-based adaptation can provide multiple benefits such as poverty alleviation, sustainable development, carbon storage, and biodiversity protection. And I think that's really where we need to be thinking in the future, that it's not just about climate change. We have to incorporate our thinking about development, about poverty, about carbon storage, and of course about biodiversity. It really is the fabric of life on this planet that is enabling us to maintain and have to protect. So thank you very much. Congratulations, Jimena, for keeping up. I hand over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. Te agradecemos bastante, Owen. And now we would like to ask all the community of practice to ask your questions to Owen. Hemos agradecido a Owen y ahora invitamos a toda la comunidad de práctica que por favor hagan sus preguntas en el chat y Owen les responderá. Para sus preguntas tendremos alrededor de unos 30 minutos, preguntas y respuestas. Please ask your questions in the chat. For your questions and Owen answers, we will have 30 minutes.
Perdón, no, creo que no me escucharon. Pueden hacer las preguntas habladas o por escritas y yo los voy a traducir, sea por el chat o habladas.
Bueno, yo tengo una pregunta. I have a question, Owen. ¿Cuál es el costo de las medidas de adaptación en base a ecosistemas que tú conozcas en alguna de las experiencias? Owen, do you have any information about the figures, the numbers, of how much could these ecosystem-based adaptations strategies could cost?
Well, the cost is obviously highly dependent on the the scale of what one tries to do, and for instance, if you wanted to manage the coral reef or protect the coral reef and restore it, it could cost several $100,000 per hectare. That's to do restoration. But if you look at the actual value of the ecosystem services that you would get from that, they would probably be, returned within a couple of years. So the return on investment is really the question I think that's interesting to look at. What is the return on investment using an ecosystem-based approach? And I think this is where there are some very exciting possibilities with coral restoration, with mangrove restoration. Certainly, it's not as straightforward. How much does it cost to build a wall? This requires management. It requires community involvement. It requires monitoring. So there's an ongoing cost, but the services provided are much richer and many and more varied than a simple engineering solution.
Oh, thank you. When there are other questions, please, Jimena and Maria, if you could support us with this part.
Yes, there is one question from Aida Velasco. She says, thank you very much. And she asks if there are options for adaptation based on ecosystem-based adaptation to buffer the storms in areas that have buildings, and in areas that have buildings and that do not have coral reefs nor mangroves. So are
Okay,
there
but
options for adaptation, for
uh-huh.
eco-based adaptation, to buffer the storms in places that have buildings but that do not have coral reefs or mangroves?
Okay, just
Well, obviously,
to
if you
ask
have a
Owen, sorry, Owen,
no problem.
please can you go slow so Jimena can translate to Spanish?
Certainly,
The
ecosystems present along a coastal area, like coral reefs or mangroves, but there are buildings that need to be protected, then the options are to build a wall, a rigid coastal protection on land, or to actually build a coastal defense in the sea, where you can actually build a artificial reef which can have living structures on it. So you can plant corals on it. You can create an artificial reef and plant corals, and fish will come. So I think you can still use an ecosystem-based adaptation approach in places where there is no existing ecosystem, but where one could be created by providing the right substrate, the right framework for that. And there are examples of this happening now around the world.
Thank you, Owen. So, en la siguiente, ¿podrías explicarnos una vez más sobre la diapositiva de costo-beneficio? Jimé, a ver si nos ayudas con esto también.
Yes, the question is if you could expand upon the slide of the cost benefit, about the cost and benefits.
I'm not sure how I get back to that slide, but this is the slide on is this slide here?
Es este,
Where I
es
talk
este
about,
¿quién es el
Hizo la
or is
Viviana,
it the slide on?
Viviana, exacto.
Viviana Angélica Castro. I think there was a slide where you had a table that
Yes,
had
okay,
a
this one.
cost.
This one.
Yes, I think that is the table. Yes.
No, I think it was earlier. That's about the values.
Mhm.
There was one that was much earlier than that.
This one?
No. There's one that had tables and a bunch of. I think it
This
was.
one?
I think it was. This
Yes,
es
I
este,
think
Viviana.
This one?
Sí, que luego Viviana ha preguntado dónde se calculan los costos-beneficios de obras y el daño evitado del
Yeah,
ejemplo de las Islas Fiji.
Es ese.
A ver
Es
si me
ese.
traduces, porfa, Jime.
Yes, so, no, creo, Mapu, creo que Viviana está diciendo cuál es el slide donde se calculan los costos, beneficios y el daño evitado del ejemplo de las islas de Fiji. So I think Viviana is just confirming that the slide that Owen, I think this is a slide. Okay, so Viviana, Viviana, tú querías que Owen expanda, profundice en esto. ¿Hay alguna pregunta específica que quieras que él responda o algún enfoque? Owen, we're just asking Viviana if she could be a little bit more specific about the question. She wants, like, what she wants you to expand upon. So we're just waiting for her to type her question right now.
It's typing.
But this is a slide. This is a slide she was referring to. Let me just take a look at the other questions. While we wait for Viviana, another question, Owen, just so you can start thinking about it, is if you could expand a little bit about the resilience concept from the EBA approach. Okay, so Viviana asks why the damage avoided seems to be more efficient.
Why the,
I know,
sorry, could
be
you
more.
repeat that?
Yeah, I think there's a to her question because she asks
Well,
why do you see it? Why is a damage avoided if you apply engineering options? Why are those why are engineering options more efficient in avoiding damage? I think that's the question.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a very good question because actually, what is interesting about these figures is that an engineering option alone, like for instance a solid seawall, will be very effective at protecting and avoiding damages for what's behind it up to a certain point, obviously, and then it will not be high enough or break, but will be perhaps more effective for extreme inundation, since flooding gradually through a mangrove will not protect a house behind it. So you can't, avoid perhaps some of the damage that you would with a sea wall. Using an ecosystem-based approach, you create many other benefits from the ecosystem services that you can generate from, in this case, it was mostly mangrove and coral reef protection, in terms of food, in terms of fuel, in terms of provisioning services mostly. So the cost, the benefit ratio is higher, but you may not be able to provide as great a level of protection than a concrete rigid wall. And this is something that I think is open to discussion. Some people would argue that mangroves are particularly effective at protecting coastal areas, and they are. They're much cheaper, certainly wall. But if you had a building that needed protection, it's possible that an engine solution is the one you would choose because it would be probably more secure in the event of a very big storm.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand your answer. So the question was, why are engineering options more efficient in avoiding damage? So what you're saying, and please, correct me if I'm wrong, if the engineering options are more effective. Wait, sorry. You know what? To be honest, I didn't quite understand. I didn't quite understand your answer. Because I know both
study
approaches are efficient, but the ecosystem-based approach, like say through developing a mangrove, will be efficient, but it won't protect. It won't stop the storm completely from advancing.
That's right. So what the study was really putting forward is that the best option really is one where you have a combination of the two. So where you have, let's say, a coastline with farms and small communities and a long stretch of coastline, you may want to just use ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. But when you have particularly concentrated infrastructure like a town or an airport or a port that was high value and needed a very effective protection, you would probably have an engineering solution. So what they're suggesting is a combination of the two is really often the best approach.
Okay, so creo que mejor I think I'm going to explain it spoken. Entonces, el estudio, lo que el estudio demostró es que la mejor opción es una opción que combine el enfoque basado en ecosistemas con el enfoque de ingeniería. Sin embargo, cuando lo que se necesita proteger es infraestructura, o sea, es, por ejemplo, un aeropuerto o es un área donde hay un montón de edificios. Entonces, las opciones de ingeniería son mucho más efectivas en protegerlo completamente. Entonces, por ejemplo, si tú comparas un muro de contención alrededor de un aeropuerto, va a parar, no va a dejar que el nivel de agua o sea, que el agua entre. Sin embargo, si ahí pones un manglar, si desarrollas un manglar, sí, el manglar va a parar un poco la inundación, pero va a, o sea, no va a dejar completamente que el agua no llegue al aeropuerto. ¿Ves? Entonces, esa es la diferencia entre los dos, pero la mejor opción es una combinación de los dos.
Perfecto, Jimé. Vamos a la siguiente. Eh, Laura Gordon. ¿Lees ahí en la pizarra, Jimé?
Laura Gordon, Sea project looks very good. Will you be expanding? Sí, si es que Laura, yes, Laura, just a quick question. I don't know if you speak English or Spanish. Could you be more specific about your question? Will you be expand? Is there a specific aspect that you would like Owen to expand upon?
Y mientras Laura nos responde, podemos responderle de Silvia también.
Okay, while we wait for Laura or Owen, we have a question from Sylvia. She says, regarding the example of one of the projects you have presented, what is the effect of shifting fishing further from the coast? So offshore fishing. So what is the effect of offshore fishing?
So this is a very interesting area, which is a bit controversial, but so in many communities in the Caribbean, fishing was primarily targeted at the reef fish, the groupers, the snappers, the parrotfish, the fish that live on the reef, which we now understand to be very important for the resilience and the survival of the coral reef. These fish have been very badly depleted, and as a consequence, many reefs have now collapsed. There's a time delay between the collapse of the fish and the collapse of the reef, could be several years, but we know that high fishing pressure on coral reefs does ultimately lead to a decline in the reef itself. So fishing pressure has in many places already shifted to offshore fishing for pelagic fish like tuna, for instance, or mahi-mahi, dolphin fish, billfish in some instances in the Caribbean, but mostly it's the tuna that people are targeting. And there's a range of tuna species. And not all of those fish stocks are sustainable, but some of them are. Some of the small tuna stocks are seen to be much more sustainable. Dolphin fish or mahi-mahi is also seen to be perhaps more less vulnerable. It's a very fecund fish. It has a very wide geographic distribution, a very fast growth rate, so that there might be good reasons for encouraging fishermen to be targeting some of these more maybe sustainable offshore fish stocks. Many fishermen are able to do this, but they just need some help with some equipment for safety, and also help with markets. Sometimes the market, especially in Jamaica, is for reef fish and not for offshore pelagic fish. So I think there's a strong argument in the Caribbean management of reef fish and hopefully reduce the fishing pressure, which is, I think, going to be essential for effective ecosystem-based adaptation in many Caribbean countries.
Ya, a ver, yo he traducido algo de su respuesta por el chat, pero básicamente la idea principal acá es que tradicionalmente, o sea, la pregunta era ¿cuál es el cuál era cuál es el efecto de
Acá está.
mover la pesca fuera más lejos de la costa, ¿no? Lo que se llama el offshore fishing. Entonces, tradicionalmente, la pesca de la área, ¿no? de la región caribeña se enfocaba en los peces que vivían dentro del arrecife. Por ejemplo, el parrotfish, ¿no? El pez loro y otros que ahorita no me acuerdo exactamente cuáles son, pero ese era el enfoque de la pesca. Entonces se dieron cuenta después de muchos, no, de décadas, después de un montón de tiempo, que ¿cómo se dice? Al deplete, al pescar tanto estos peces, estaban afectando indirectamente, bueno, no indirectamente, directamente también al arrecife. Entonces, mientras, mientras desaparecían estas poblaciones de peces que vivían en el arrecife, también desaparecía el arrecife, pero el efecto entre uno y otro no era inmediato. Entonces, pero ya se daban cuenta de que ya se daban cuenta de este efecto y estaban encontrando que hay otras poblaciones de peces que están más lejos de la costa, por ejemplo el atún o el atún delfín, que es el maji-maji, que tienen características que los hacen más sostenibles. Por ejemplo, la población de esos peces crecen rápidamente, abarcan una amplia región geográfica, entonces es más sostenible y no afecta a los arrecifes. Entonces, una cosa que tienen que tener en cuenta es que el mercado todavía existe para los peces que viven en el arrecife. Entonces, eso es un tema ¿no? que están viendo y ya. Entonces, esa sería la respuesta para Silvia. Espero que haya sido completa.
Mario Luis también tiene otra pregunta, Jimé. Ahí está en la
Okay.
pizarra.
Yep. So this is a question from Mario Luis. He lives in a high altitude area of Guatemala, and he didn't know, or he ignored, he didn't know about the great problems that other communities face. In Guatemala, they are trying to save, quote unquote, save the Atitlan Lake. And just so you know, the Atitlan Lake is a lake that is surrounded by volcanoes. And his question is, can the methods and the analysis used to evaluate the coasts, could these methods also be applied to evaluate lakes? If so, could you please share with us some experience you may have had with lakes?
I'm sure, well, the quick answer is I haven't got any personal experience with lakes, but I'm sure that a similar approach methodology could be used to look at the value of the lake's ecosystems for the community and also for the resilience of the surrounding area. So the approach, I'm sure, would be applicable. It's certainly a generic methodology. So you would need to talk to a specialist on lakes, but I'm very confident that the methodology would be valid.
Ya, básicamente para resumir su respuesta, él personalmente no tiene una experiencia no con lagos, pero esta es una metodología genérica, entonces él piensa que de la misma manera que se ha aplicado esa metodología en costas, se podría aplicar en los lagos, básicamente para evaluar la resiliencia de las comunidades, ¿no? Y acá hablo solamente de mi experiencia, yo supongo como Atitlán está, o sea, pienso, no conozco, pero pienso que uno de los más altos riesgos son los terremotos. Entonces, se podría adaptar quizás la metodología hacia eso, pero mejor ahí paro porque no soy especialista. Entonces, vamos con Carolina. Carolina asks, she would like to ask, hold on just a second, let me read it. Okay, just as the ecosystems can be divided into zones, is it possible to categorize or to match the ecosystem services? Las coberturas. Ay, Carolina, discúlpame, pero no entiendo muy bien tu pregunta. Que quisiera preguntar si así como se pueden zonificar, es posible delimitar los servicios ecosistémicos. a las coberturas presentes a lo largo de un
Jorge, creo
paisaje.
que te va a
Sí,
Jorge,
Jimena,
sí,
en realidad la primera parte de la pregunta es una exposición, ¿no? Así como se usan servicios ecosistémicos, la pregunta en sí es si en caso ocurra un impacto en un lugar específico, es posible identificar, o sea, la realidad a partir de dicha vendría a ser la pregunta. La primera parte es como una antecedente, ¿no?
ya. Que sea posible, ¿en qué medida se impactó?
Sería posible identificar en qué medida se impacta el servicio ecosistémico y cómo se puede hallar, bueno, valor marginal, eso sí, no sé a qué se referirá en relación a lo que es lo que ocurra una catástrofe por ejemplo, el derrame petrolero, ¿no?
Yeah. Okay, I'll
Construcción,
try
¿no?
my best. Yeah, I'll try my best to translate this question. Is it possible, taking for example the construction of an oil well, is it possible to identify the impact of that construction? Like what impact will that construction have on the ecosystemic service, on the ecosystem service? And additionally, how could the marginal value be found? Pero aquí mi pregunta, Carolina, es ¿cómo se podría llegar al el valor marginal de qué cosa? El valor marginal
del
del,
impacto, me parece.
del el valor,
I,
o sea,
I think
medir.
maybe I do. I think I might understand and have a go at the answer if I can. The the cost of any development on the environment can be calculated, and that's what environmental impact assessments should do, is to really do a detailed assessment of just the magnitude of the impact on the environment and characterize it as best they can. It can be very complex. And in many instances nowadays, when a big development, for instance, in this case, you're talking about an oil well, needs to go ahead, and the government decide that there is no alternative but to go ahead, the value, as you were saying, this marginal value, the cost that this development would have on the ecosystem services, the reduction of ecosystem services can be offset. So the offset idea is basically that the company or the organization that's developing something would then have to provide a value equal to the loss of ecosystem services elsewhere. And that could be in planting forest or doing conservation work to try and basically offset the damage that they've done somewhere. So this whole notion of impacting on the environment, on ecosystem services, and quantifying that impact needs to be now used in conjunction with the offset mechanisms. Now, this needs to be done very carefully and shouldn't be a green card to allow developers to basically say, well, it's okay, we can we can restore some environment elsewhere. But it is something that needs to be carefully considered when developments are considered important for national strategies, for national priorities.
Ok. Ya, para resumir la respuesta de Owen, sí se puede medir, no, o sea, usando la. So sorry, Owen, just to make sure. So it is possible to measure, like to identify and measure the the specific ecosystem services in a specific area, like in a very specific area, like for example, the area where they are building the oil well. You're saying it is possible to measure that, correct?
Well, I mean, it's obviously going to be complicated depending on the currents, depending on the existing ecosystem, depending on what the impacts are in terms of not just the drilling. When they actually drill the well, there are lots of various impacts downstream, down current from the well. but also sometimes people might argue that a well could have some beneficial impacts in terms of the fish life that then lives in the well. So I'm not at all in favor of having more oil wells, rather the opposite. But I think one can look at these developments very methodologically and quantify the scale of the disturbance, but also in some instances maybe they do offer some habitat for the species. In the Gulf of Mexico, you know, some fisheries have bounced back because of the enormous number of artificial reefs, which are actually oil wells. So, you know, it's an interesting picture.
Okay, okay, Carolina, lo que dice Owen es que sí se puede medir el impacto, ¿no? Sí se puede medir los servicios ecosistémicos, pero es bien complicado porque en algunos ejemplos, por ejemplo en el Golfo de México, se ha visto que gracias a los pozos petroleros se han creado arrecifes artificiales. Entonces, en esa situación ha aumentado la población de peces. Entonces, al calcular, al calcular o al medir estos servicios ecosistémicos, se tiene que considerar, o sea, es bien complicado porque no solamente son el impacto negativo, pero también puede ser el impacto positivo. Y él hace la salvedad que él no está promoviendo, él no está a favor de que se construyan más pozos petroleros, pero sí reconoce que en algunos casos sí hay beneficios. Ahora, lo que él también mencionó un poco antes es que una manera de trabajar ¿no? con las empresas petroleras es al calcular el impacto negativo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, de la construcción del pozo, se puede pedir, se debería pedir a la empresa que pongan medidas para balancear esos costos. Entonces, por ejemplo, plantar arrecifes artificiales o cualquier otra medida que pueda, lo que se llama offset, o sea, balancear los impactos negativos. Sin embargo, estas medidas, o sea, esta posibilidad de balancear no debería ser darles una carta blanca a esas empresas. Entonces, es algo complicado, pero sí se podría negociar. Ya, una última pregunta. My question is oriented towards criteria to evaluate resilience by my hypothesis that this could be similar. Yeah, Rodrigo, perdón, ¿cuál es tu pregunta?
It's more a comment, I think.
Okay. Okay, so I guess
Oh, no,
his comment.
There it is. Sorry. I'm copying again. I know it's the same.
Okay, so basically, I think Rodrigo is asking for like maybe a confirmation or your comments on his hypothesis. So the context is it's about the criteria to evaluate the resilience. The resilience, the biological. So his hypothesis is if this criteria can be similar to the ones used for vulnerability assessment.
I think Rodrigo is right. I think the whole concept of resilience is very connected to vulnerability, obviously, and the two can be assessed using a similar approach. Resilience has many definitions and has been used in a number of different disciplines in different ways, but ecological resilience is something that's a very complex subject, and I didn't have time, but maybe now is an opportunity for me to just show that slide. Somebody else was asking about expanding on the idea of resilience. Resilience is in an ecosystem is often linked to a number of factors and is extremely important in our way forwards with ecosystem-based adaptation, we need to understand what makes these systems resilient. So can I go back to the presentation? I just do that. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to show this graph about the resilience in the context of coral reefs. So this is some work that was done by Pete Mumby and colleagues, which I think is extremely interesting. So this diagram looks rather complicated, but let me just explain what this is about. So on the vertical axis here, we have percentage coral cover, so from 0 to 90. And on the horizontal axis, we have the grazing. That means the proportion of the reef that is grazed in 6 months. That means fish, parrotfish, and urchins eating the algae. Okay, so the more fish there are, the further you are along this axis, and the more coral you have, the higher you are up this axis. Now, a coral reef will try to be very healthy and about 85% live coral. A coral reef likes to be up here, and that's its climax as an ecosystem. A very degraded reef will be down here, less than 5% or around 5% when it's basically covered in algae. Now, what makes a reef go towards a healthy 85% live coral reef or down and degrade depends on whether it's on the right side of this line here. This modest line shows that a reef with a very high level of coral will stay in this green zone where it's recovering, so moving back up towards a healthy state, whereas one that is in this orange area is going to degrade. And so in a degraded reef, let's say, where you've got around 20% live coral, you need a lot of fish and urchins to enter the green zone to be a healthy, resilient reef that actually recovers after a disturbance. Whereas if you're already very healthy, you don't need that many fish. Does that make sense? I know I'm not going to get a verbal answer, but so this diagram this is a model. This is a model that was done by Pete Mumby and his team to show how resilience of coral reefs is connected to fish grazing. And in these arrows here represent what happened in Jamaica, where you had a big decline coral cover from the 70s to the 1980s. I think this was linked initially to a hurricane. So grazing didn't change, but there was major hurricane damage. It started to recover. But then in '83, we had a die-off of diadema, a sturgeon, and the grazing pressure dropped dramatically. There were already very few parrotfish, so the grazing pressure dropped right down to here, and from there the reefs just started to degrade. The algae started to grow over them, and there was no longer any grazed area of reef where small corals that are settling on the reef can find a place to settle. So if you don't have any places for corals to settle because it's covered in algae, the reef can't recover. So it's a mechanism that's actually quite easy to understand, but when you model it, you end up with this curve. So this is really showing how ecosystem resilience is a complex characteristic which has a number of factors involved in it. The percentage of live coral and the amount of grazing here being very important in how resilient an ecosystem is. And I think with social resilience, again, we would have very complex metrics for what makes a community resilient. There's a whole range of factors, whether they have insurance, whether they have education, whether they have support services in their towns, whether the government can provide shelters and backups. So again, very complex words, but the similarity between resilience and vulnerability is definitely very, very clear. They're sort of diametrically opposed. Uh, the more vulnerable you are, the less resilient you're likely to be, and the more resilient you are, the less vulnerable. I hope that's helped explain a bit this rather complex concept.
Okay, thank you, Owen. Bueno, Jimena ha tenido que salir. Vamos a tratar de traducir un poco, pero básicamente, Owen lo que se refería es a que resiliencia es un término, una definición muy compleja, tanto desde el punto de vista de resiliencia ecológica como de resiliencia social. En principio, resiliencia es la capacidad, ya sea del ecosistema, como es el gráfico que acaba de salir, de un ecosistema para poder recuperarse por sí mismo. Y él ponía el ejemplo que debido a la sobrecarga de la pesca, llegó un momento en que las áreas de las grass áreas desaparecen. Entonces allí, bueno, había una línea blanca sobre la cual el autor de este gráfico mencionaba que era, digamos, la zona de resiliencia, es decir, cuando esta comunidad ecológica podía recuperarse a su estado original sin mayor intervención de prácticas de recuperación del ecosistema. Igualmente, desde el punto de vista de resiliencia social, es un tema complejo saber hasta qué punto una comunidad, una sociedad pueda, después de ser afectada por algún agente externo, como puede ser cambio climático, a retomar a su vida normal, ¿no? Sin tener algún tipo de soporte externo. Eh, bueno, esa ha sido ya la última pregunta. Gracias a todos los participantes de la comunidad. Carolina Parilla estaba ahí queriendo participar, compartir algunas cosas. Le hemos sugerido que, al igual que ella, todos puedan poner sus consultas, sus preguntas, sus comentarios dentro de la comunidad de práctica durante los últimos días que nos queden en ese tema, esta semana y la que viene. Owen, thank you very much for your presentation. This group was really interested in the ecosystems based adaptation and your experience in the Caribbean and the coastal ecosystem. We invite also you to support us in these weeks. If people have more questions, I will send you these questions in English in order I could make the answers also in Spanish. Because there are some people who are asking your email and something like that because they want to know more about your experiences. Bueno, les damos las gracias a todos y bueno, más allá de también participar estas semanas, los invitamos al siguiente webinar que será durante el mes de octubre y estará referido ya a otro ecosistema, que es un ecosistema de repente no natural, ¿no? Que es lo que está pasando con la adaptación en las ciudades. En el mes de octubre estará a cargo nuevamente Juan Torres de la moderación. Yo regreso en noviembre con un tema muy interesante que será áreas protegidas y con y bajo una modalidad que les gustará a todos ustedes. Thank you, Owen, and all the people who speak English in our community of practice. We will be still in this 10 the following weeks, and in October we will have the next webinar who will be talking about cities and ecosystem-based approach.
Ok, gracias a
Okay,
todos. Solamente, thank you, Owen.
and pleasure, and thank you very much, George and Maria. Thank you very much.
Ok, gracias. Thank you, thank you. Bueno, vamos a estar nuevamente, ya había comentado, pero vamos a estar traduciendo el documento y vamos a colgar el video como con todos los webinars esta semana. Así que los invitamos nuevamente, como dijo Jorge, a que entren a la comunidad, a la comunidad de práctica AVE y van a poder encontrar la presentación de Owen del día de hoy traducida y la original en inglés. Muchas gracias a todos por participar. Ya nos vemos en el próximo webinar que vamos a estarles mandando la invitación eh, con anticipación. Muchas gracias a todos. Nos vemos la próxima. Bye.
Okay, bye bye. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.